Hi, I'm Tammy Woodbury, and I've been selling real estate in the upstate of South Carolina for more than 20 years. So whether you're looking to move to the upstate of South Carolina in 9 days or in 9 months or 9 weeks, I'd love to talk to you more about it. Now, maybe you've heard recently that the real estate laws have changed. Maybe you've heard rumors like sellers no longer have to pay buyer agent commissions, buyers no longer have to pay buyer agent commissions, or buyers have to pay buyer agent commissions. Or maybe you've heard nothing about it, or maybe you know nothing about this. Well, today is a super exciting day. I am sitting down with Bradley Richardson, who is a local real estate attorney. He's been practicing real estate law, facilitating closings for more than 20 years. Now, when I say facilitating closings, if you don't know, I don't want to use industry language. Closing is the day that you would go buy your house. Now, every state's different. If you are in a state right now and you've never involved an attorney, what that probably means is that you are in a title-run state, which means there's a title company. They basically do all the paperwork and then they send it to you, and that's how you buy and sell real estate. That's just the pen and paper to actually selling the home, okay? In our state of South Carolina, we have what's known as a roundtable closing, which in my opinion is better because an attorney will sit down and they will actually go over what the title company has researched, making sure they answer questions and things like that. So today, Brad and I in this exclusive interview are going to talk about these law changes, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, how it's impacting the industry, what agents need to know, what consumers need to know. And if you stay tuned to the end, you're going to hear, if you are a buyer, ways that you can avoid paying commission if it's just not in your budget or you don't want to do it, but you don't want to sacrifice having representation and protection on your biggest purchase. So stay tuned. Here we go. All right, hey, I'm Tammy, and in case someone watching doesn't know who Bradley K. Richardson is, also known as Brad, he's been practicing real estate law for nearly 25 years. Looks 25 years old, but he's actually been in business for 25 years. So he has multiple firms and locations in the upstate of South Carolina. He also has several top-tier attorney partners and an incredible staff. So if you didn't also know, these things matter in the world of law. We have title companies. We'll talk more about those later, but he's a top producing agent for WFG National Title Insurance Company and has been so for the last 6 years. And his respect in this world of law practice is so high that he's also currently serving on the South Carolina Board of Governors, which in the world of real estate, or if you don't really know, that's very impressive. It means that he has high ethics and people respect him and his opinion and how he leads. So basically, he's knowledgeable on the highest level when it comes to law practices and is very well versed in real estate. So Brad, thank you so much for taking time just to talk with us today. Everyone is already aware that we're talking about this NAR settlement, how it's impacting agents, consumers, misconceptions, things the media has said that may or may not be true or have an ounce of truth. So just want to ask you some questions today and kind of hear your thoughts on what you've observed, experienced, and what you know as it pertains to law. So first, what things have you heard or observed with agents in the practice of real estate with regard to these changes recently? Maybe misinformation or just thoughts in general?
Well, one thought in general is no one has the answer. Everybody likes to have the answer. And, we've got some guidelines from DOJ, we've got some guidelines from our local associations. Everyone's still finding their way through. And right now, you ask 10 professionals, you perhaps will get 10 different answers. So I think it's important to understand, why there was a lawsuit, why there was this lawsuit, and why there was a settlement. In layman's terms, the plaintiffs in the lawsuit were alleging by consistently paying 6% commission that the parties had engaged in somewhat of a price fixing type scheme. I won't get into whether that's correct, whether that's incorrect. It's just a fact. When it's settled, it kind of presumptively said, okay, we've got to get away from this practice. So when you think about it in this terms, if it was a $100,000 house and you said 6% was the commission, the argument is you've inflated the price by 6%, and that extrapolates over time. So now we've got to get away from that. And the thing that I like, I'll say that I like about this, is now we are back to you can negotiate. You negotiate everything. Now we're just not negotiating price, we're negotiating commissions, whether my seller's paying it or my buyer's paying it, what are my concessions. You really take it for granted in our industry, agents are negotiating every term. So now everything's subject to negotiation. The misconception I see, I'll hear people say as a blanket statement, well, now my buyer has to pay my commission, or now my seller doesn't have to pay commission. And I don't know that's necessarily 100% accurate. And I don't mean that like, hey, no one's going to show my house if I don't want to offer commission. I do think that's a misconception. What the reality is, I may have to be willing to offer some commission, or I may have to take less money so that the agent is paid by the buyer. Some way, shape, or form, everything's subject to negotiation. So when you start saying absolute, like my buyer doesn't have to, or my seller doesn't have to, there's a lot of caveats that go with it.
Some points you made, I was thinking as you were talking, as a listing agent, if I'm going in to, talk to a seller about selling their home, the one thing, because agents have a lot of strong opinions about these changes that I think is great is for years, you go in for a listing and you are negotiating for your commission that, represents your cost to market, negotiate, represent all the things, our insurance and everything that we're responsible for to protect and represent and market for the seller. But then we used to also have to negotiate this surprise buyer agent commission. For the buyer agent, we didn't even know who they were. So it was kind of crazy to negotiate their paycheck and them representing a buyer in the future when we didn't really know what their skill set was. We didn't know if they were going to represent the buyer well. We didn't know if they were going to help facilitate an easy transaction. So like you said, I like that every term is negotiable now. It kind of puts it all out there, which that's one of the points of the DOJ was transparency. Instead of having this number that's fixed, and Brad used the language price fixing, just to clarify, because I know those are words that seem familiar, but price fixing is basically, hey, I because of the way I presented something, everyone expects that's what's going to happen. And even though you should be able to negotiate it, we've already shown our hand. So for instance, a strategy a lot of times with buyers, let's say they're making an offer and the home's $400,000 and the buyer can pay $400,000, but they only want to pay $375,000. They'll talk to their mortgage lender and say, hey, I know I'm approved for $400,000, but don't put that on the letter. Write $375,000 on there, because I know that if the seller sees I'm qualified for more money, they're definitely going to want me to pay more, because you're setting a tone with what the payment or offering should be. So what they were asserting, like Brad was saying, is that when we say up front the commission's 3% for the buyer agent, 3% for the seller's agent, 6% total, who's going to ask for less when we've already said this is what the standard is? So now we're not putting the commission out there for a buyer agent, not saying a seller won't pay like Brad was saying, but we have the option to discuss how much the seller will pay. And Brad, I want to ask your opinion on this. And actually, before I do that, can you define in layman's terms when it comes down to how we are negotiating commission in general? So we were told it can't be in the MLS anymore. And for those of you who don't know, the way listings get to Zillow, Realtor.com, all those websites, agents are members of this other program software, just to put it softly, and these boards called the Multiple Listing Service, and that's the MLS. That's where we put all the pertinent information about the house, and that goes to Zillow, Realtor.com, Trulia, Redfin, all those websites, okay? So historically, we've put the buyer agent commission in there so the buyer agents knew how much they would get paid. Part of the DOJ settlement said we cannot put any information like that out there ever again. They've gotten really silly about it. Even in our remarks, if I say there's a bonus room in a house, I can't even say the word bonus anymore, because they say, hey, that could be considered bonus, like financial. And I'm like, so now we have to call it finished room over the garage to get out of saying the word bonus, okay? So Brad, where I'm going with this is if you can explain, if this is no longer in the MLS, agents feel the need to do business the old way. So they're pre-asking their sellers, how much commission would you pay? And let's say the seller says 3%. Agents are getting really creative about how they're telling other agents about this. I've heard them writing it on key tags and putting it in their boxes that are on the doors, which that's actually technically illegal as a side note because of MLS rules there, but they're putting sign writers on signs out front that say the seller's paying. Some of them are going so far as to say the amount. They're sending automatic emails. Some of them have their voicemail set up to say that the seller's paying commission and how much. So Can you define in layman's terms the DOJ rule for avoiding price fixing, and maybe a lens people can use to say, is that practice wise, or am I really violating the tenet of what the DOJ was trying to stop?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I ever want to put myself in a position of saying I know what the DOJ is thinking. However, all those practices you just mentioned make me extremely nervous as an attorney. The whole point is the DOJ does not want the predetermined commissions put out there. I think if you are saying we're definitely paying 3%, we're definitely paying $2,000, that kind of speaks to the problem that DOJ said they had under the old way. So I personally do not think you should put anything out there like that. Now, if you want to tell another agent, my seller's willing to consider it, that's a factual statement. You're not committing to a percentage, you're not committing to anything in particular. If your seller's open to everything, considering all offers, then do it. And this leads me to a point I really want to make. I feel like a lot of buyer's agents want to do a lot of verbal negotiating right now. And I'm not a proponent of verbal negotiating, whether it's in representation of my clients or any other deals that we do as attorneys. If you want to make me an offer, put it in writing, sign your name to it. Put the onus back on me as the listing agent, as the seller, or the attorney representing the seller to present that offer, talk about the pros and the cons, what can we live with, what can we not live with. You never know. There may be some change of heart by our client, or they may say, hey, this is a pretty strong offer because of other factors. Hey, it's all cash, for example. Or, hey, it's a quick close. Or, I feel really strong that this particular buyer's represented by agent A and lender B. There could be extenuating factors that would make me say, yeah, okay, I'll pay you a commission. But I don't personally think you should do a lot of verbal negotiating. Put it in writing, take a few minutes, fill out the contract, send it over. Make a seller respond to it.
That's great. I'm glad you said make a seller respond to it, because in our state, verbal agreements or negotiations are allowed, but they're not enforceable. But also, you don't necessarily know, and I hate to say this, but you don't know if that agent has articulated what you wanted the seller to hear. So like to Brad's point, if it's in writing, they have to legally present that so the seller sees the collection of terms. And Brad, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but my observation over the course of my career is when a seller hears term, even if the agent does a good job and tells you every term in the offer, which they usually don't. They usually tell you price, they might tell you closing date. They don't tell you all the other terms that could blow up, by the way, in a transaction later. They kind of highlight the ones they think that are the most important, closing date and price, and if there's closing costs involved, any cost to the seller. But there are other things that could cost a seller. But I've observed that when it's in writing, a seller takes it seriously. When it's not in writing, especially if it's not a cherry of a deal, which usually if it's verbal, it's not. They're just kind of on a fishing expedition. They may not be, but in my observation, that's what a seller thinks. So my sellers always give better counteroffers or accept if it's in writing. If it's verbal, we generally don't see the same favorable response from a seller. Have you seen the same thing? Would you agree?
I agree. And I mean, it's not just in real estate. If you've ever sold anything on Marketplace or Craigslist, anybody can negotiate via text, right? Till it's time to hand over the cash, the deal has not been made. Likewise, if I'm a seller, I really don't want to waste my time with back and forth verbal. Send me an offer in writing. Then I'm going to ask my very qualified listing agent to prepare me a net sheet. We're going to go through the terms. We're going to decide on its own merits. Is this the type of deal I want to entertain or not? And that's not to say a seller should always, as a buyer, you should expect a seller to take or leave a deal. You expect a counter. It's going to happen. We're negotiating. It's not a take it or leave it kind of proposition. But, likewise, I've been part of the negotiations myself. You hear, well, we're expecting another offer, or so it's, we've got another verbal. Great. Here's what I'm willing to do. You got 48 hours to review it, or 24 hours to review it, and give me an answer. You give me no answer, that is my answer. You're not interested in my offer. I like the forcing of the hand, if you will. And let me give this one piece of free advice to everyone, not just sellers, buyers as well. Read the contract. If you do not understand a term, that is your opportunity to ask. whether it be your agent, whether you hire a real estate attorney, feel free to ask. What you never want to find yourself in a position after the contract has been signed saying, well, I didn't read it. I relied upon my agent or my lawyer or my lender or whoever. You need to read it. You need to understand it. That's the value. Quite frankly, that's a value that your agent, listing agent, selling agent is going to provide you, is that it is their job to understand the contracts. It is their job to complete the contracts with the terms that you're willing to offer and or accept. But please take the time to read it. I know, especially in this time right now, you're getting, agency agreements and compensation agreements, and you've got a contract, and you've got all these disclosures about wire fraud. I get it. It can make your mind kind of spin a little bit, make your eyes cross. This should be the most important investment you ever make for most folks. Take the time to read it. Don't just blindly DocuSign.
Right.
So I went down a rabbit hole a little bit on that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's funny for us, our practice on our team is we go over the offer before they sign it. But, I'll sometimes be beside other agents and they're not doing anything wrong. I mean, they sent the contract to the client to sign and they intended to call them, and then they'll have an automatic email back within like a minute of, everything signed. I mean, you could be the fastest reader on the planet. There's no way you read, 32 pages in a minute and then signed everything. And Brad has not said this yet, but we'll dive into this a little bit later. But there is now the DOJ, the other big rule that was the eye opener that we've never experienced, is they said, hey, a buyer can no longer, there's only one way, and we'll talk about it in a second, but a buyer can no longer see a home with an agent unless they have signed a buyer agency contract. And I want to pause because it's super important. Brad said read. In the state of South Carolina, okay, so this isn't everywhere, I don't think, we used to have a buyer agency agreement. Please notice the name change. It is a buyer agency contract that you are signing with an agent. So one, interview your agent because this is serious. But in that contract, it stipulates how they get paid. Now, there's 3 options. We'll talk about those later. But 2 of the options, you are responsible for paying the agent. And right now, what I'm hearing a lot within our industry, and it's well-intentioned, very well-intentioned, but an agent may say, oh, you owe me 3%, but if the seller won't pay all of that or any of that, I'll reduce my commission. And the agreement that they can make with you, that is 100% allowed. And the contract does say that you can amend it, which means you can make a change later to reduce it. Problem is when you're dating and early in this relationship and you don't know how things are going to be and nobody's worked for anyone for any period of time, it's easy to say, oh, I'll just reduce it. What happens when that agent works for you for 9 months? You finally find a home, you negotiate, seller says, I'm not paying anything. Well, you look at your agent, you're like, I need you to reduce it. And in your mind, you might be thinking $500 is a lot of money. They may not be thinking $500 is a lot of money. They might be thinking $8,000 is appropriate for their time. So now we've got an issue, really the agent has an issue at that point. If you're not positioned to pay them, they could try to say you really need to pay them what is expected. And even though they told you they would negotiate and reduce it, you didn't set the amount. So you want those things in writing. If your agent says that, that's totally okay. But maybe at that time, even though you're hopeful the seller pays the full amount, and they are too, talk about what that number needs to be, because that needs to be a part of your balance sheet as a buyer, money you may end up spending if you want representation. And that leads me to my next part. There's something called an unrepresented buyer. Now, I want to pause and say one thing, and Brad, elaborate on this if you want to, or we can just go into, this will come out naturally in just a little bit. A lot of the things in the state of South Carolina we're talking about are actually not new laws. They're newly enforced. Some things I want to say, and this is kind of true for the nation, the seller never had to pay the buyer agent commission, okay? Especially in South Carolina. Our listing agreement actually has separate sections, one for the listing agent commission, one for the buyer agent. But practically speaking, agents would just ask the seller to pay the buyer agent commission upfront when they would put the home on the market, okay? Also, a buyer should have always signed an agreement before seeing a home with an agent, because an agent is extremely limited. People do not understand how limited they are on what they can tell you if they have not been hired by you to represent them. For instance, we walk through a house, technically I can open that door for you, and if I'm not hired to represent you, I can only tell you what you already know because you can already find it online. If it's public information, I can tell you, but you've been on Zillow, you already know all this information. If you want to know if it's overpriced, if you want to know if homes sell quickly in there, if you want to know what the lifestyle's like, if you want to know anything about proximity, what creates value, what takes away value, what I think the seller will do, how long the home's been on the market, if I think that that's long or short, or if they would pay your closing costs, cannot answer any of the things you really care about. So in the state of South Carolina, what has happened is we've shown homes, and basically agents would be negotiating and talking as if they were represented. Should not have been doing that. They were at their own risk at that point. But the DOJ says, hey, we want buyers thinking they're paying a seller. I'm sorry, they're paying their own agent. We don't want them thinking the seller's paying. So we want you to discuss this before you ever open a door. Now, there are some buyers who are like, I will never pay for my agent because it seems like I can't afford them already. They've not discussed that with anyone. They assume that. So they've heard there are 2 loopholes in our state and nationwide right now. The only time you do not have to pay, and it's technically the same time, but it looks different, an agent is if you work directly with the seller's agent, meaning I have a listing, I have an open house, you show up at my open house, I can let you in, you don't have to sign anything. Now I cannot answer any of those other questions I just went over, but I can let you in the house, okay? Also, if you've ever noticed new home builders like Ryan Homes, DR Horton, Mungo, they have agents that sit on site. They also work for the builder. They don't represent you. Sometimes people misunderstand. They think they work for the buyer. They work for the seller. It's like an open house as well. That's technically what it is. So you don't have to sign anything to go look at new construction communities, walk in that home. Now, if all of a sudden you want advice, you want an agent, you have to sign something. So, Brad, my question for you. Most people don't really understand what it means to be unrepresented, but if someone is already of the mindset that they just need to go this route and always call the listing agent to see a home so they never have to think about even the potential of paying a buyer agent, do you think that there's any risk there? Is that a good option for someone?
I personally think for most home buyers, that is not a good option. Just because, one, the listing agent is going to have no obligation to advise you in your best interest. First and foremost, I think sometimes the unrepresented parties think there's this, I hate to use the word obligation of honesty, because honesty is probably a bit of an overstatement, but at the same token, you're already engaged to represent the seller. And that's not to say I'm going to hide mold or damages or hidden issues, but we, again, I'm going to go back to the negotiation standpoint. Everybody's going to have their own best interest at heart. You're already representing your seller. So if you're unrepresented, you better acknowledge up front that if you do start negotiating, you're kind of on your own. Now, we can talk about dual agency. I'm not a big fan of dual agency. I think in this new world that we're in, dual agency is a very slippery slope because of the issues we've talked about. Another thing about an unrepresented party, if I'm kind of hesitant, maybe I'm old school, to just let anyone walk through my home. Open house is a different argument, new builds a new argument. So, I know part of the decision, I've read the decision, is the court kept coming back to this internet being the great equalizer. It wasn't the days of where you bought the Homes magazine and people faxed listings to each other and agents had to hustle up the information about what's available on the market. I remember when I moved back to the upstate in 2000, early days of the internet, yeah, you could look at some things online. Yeah, you could kind of, I remember telling my agent, Martha Rosenberg, love Martha Rosenberg, hey Martha, I know you sent me these 25 listings. We've already kind of looked online. We've narrowed it down to these 6, right? Now it's much more sophisticated. Pictures are better, information's better. You got sites like Zillow, Realtor.com, what have you. Even everybody's brokerage sites are much better than they used to be. But you still got to see it in person. I just don't think you should ever get away from walking through. Let's take another say. Let's just say, hey, I'm a qualified negotiator. I do this for a living, so I'm going to be unrepresented. I don't need advice from the listing agent. Now you're under contract. Who's going to handle all those details? Who do you expect to advise you on the contract? Who's going to set up the appraisal? Who's going to coordinate with the attorney? Who's going to coordinate with the title company? Who's going to order a home inspection? These are all the things that you need to be considering when you decide if you want to be an unrepresented party. It's your right. I'm never going to debate that it's your right. But you might find yourself out there on an island and not knowing where to go. There is value, and I know a lot of people have opinions on the value of your profession, Tammy, and I certainly have seen over the years the value in it. Everybody's going to have their own opinion, but there is value in having someone who is experienced, who's gone through the process, who have all the contacts, know how to coordinate the time and keep this thing on track. You know, most people, couples, single people, you got jobs, you got kids, you got things going on. Who's doing the work? Again, to help you get to the closing date of the most valuable thing you'll ever own, the biggest transaction you'll ever be in your life. So that's why I would say, I'm not going to tell people you should never be unrepresented, but you need to face the reality of what that means to be unrepresented.
That's great. One of the things that you mentioned was dual agency. So I just wanted to tap on that in case someone's not familiar. So dual agency is similar to unrepresented in that the buyer would work directly with the listing agent. So again, the agent's already been hired to represent the seller, and now the buyer's saying, hey, will you represent me? So it's a step above unrepresented because you can give some advice. However, in our state, the rule is if you're a dual agent, you then become neutral for things that could impact the other side. You know, so when I'm helping you negotiate or make a decision, if answering or counseling you on something would technically be a leg up from one party over the other, then I can't do that. So when you want to get a better deal as a buyer, or you're wondering, could we try to get the seller to do this, or would the seller take that? I can't disclose private information that would benefit the other party to the other party, but I also can't advise. So Brad, you know, as you were talking about that, you mentioned you had an opinion about dual agency. You know, do you recommend that?
I really don't. I know that may not sit well with some of my friends and clients. I just feel like, especially now, with all the things that are subject to negotiation, it's going to be really difficult to be a dual agent. I'm not saying it can't work. I'm saying the potential for a problem is too great. And I know someone may say, well, no, wait a minute, aren't you dual representation? Well, in South Carolina, it's pretty customary in a residential transaction for a closing attorney to provide services to both sides. And what we do in writing, we disclose to the seller, hey, we're only doing A, B, C, D, and E. And if you guys get into some kind of dispute contractually, we're probably going to withdraw, because there's always going to be a side to be taken on a contractual point, in my opinion. I personally think it would be very difficult to be a dual agent when maybe the seller's told you what they want to net and a buyer's told you what the top end of their budget is. It's going to be an ethical conundrum.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the points you made was about representation and being able to answer those questions. And I think that that's huge too, because it's funny when you talked about kind of the advent of Zillow and the internet, so many people think, and sometimes this is their deciding factor, hey, I don't need an agent to find me a home. The reality is you don't. I think like way long ago, like in the 1930s, we didn't have the internet at all, you know, obviously. So if you wanted to know what was for sale, you had to hire an agent. They would literally tell you the available home. So that was their job, to find you a home. The position of an agent, and like as an attorney would say this too, is our job has changed. You can get into a home without me. Someone has an open house, you can get into it. You can use the internet to vet out the homes that you're interested in without ever calling me. So sometimes people think they don't need an agent because they don't need that, and that is true. The real work, which was what you just described, happens when you're in the transaction. That's really what you're hiring an agent for, not to get in the door of a house. So that was a fair point that you mentioned that I wanted to speak to.
I think a lot of people in the public, a lot of consumers, think you guys just open up lock boxes and drive you from house to house. And I will tell you that is not anywhere close. There is a lot of work to be done between the time the contract's signed and the day we walk out of the closing room.
There was a poll done recently, and they asked, like, on average, how much do you think your agent will work? And buyers said between 10 and 15 hours, because that's the amount of time that they maybe remember texting them, calling them, seeing homes, and that's if they saw a good number of homes, because you don't usually even spend an hour at a home. So they felt like that was generous, but on average, our industry standard is 80 hours in a transaction, and that's if things go smoothly. So interesting thing that I learned recently, just a buyer's opinion of that. So speaking of that, just kind of going a little bit further with this, so we already know what an unrepresented seller is. That's a for sale by owner. People have been doing that forever. So the idea is maybe if you could be an unrepresented seller, you'd be an unrepresented buyer, you know, why not just cut out the middleman of the agent altogether? Let's just say you acknowledge all the things that you said earlier, and you know that an agent is valuable, but you think, I'm going to use a real estate attorney anyway. I'll have them handle it. The biggest thing I've heard over the years is a buyer and seller both believe that the attorney will work the deal. So tell me a little bit about, is that how that happens? Do you do all those things? Where could there be risk for either party?
Yeah, I will tell you, a lot of for sale by owners, buyers and sellers think that that's what we do. That, they walk in cold and say, hey, can I get a contract? We have a certain ethical standard we have to apply, a certain ethical standard we have to meet. I can't just pull out a form and fill in the blanks for you. Every deal's different. There's a lot of moving parts. And invariably, what will happen every time, a buyer or a seller, unrepresented, no agent, will look at one of our attorneys and say, is this a good deal? We don't know. Yes, we close lots of transactions. I don't know your neighborhood. I don't know the condition of your house. I don't know anything about your home. I can't tell you what it's worth. Then you start getting into the things I mentioned earlier. Who's going to order a termite? Who's going to let the appraiser in? There again, they think that we're here to perform those services, and that's not what we do as attorneys. Our job is to take a contract, whether we've negotiated it or not, and get it to the closing table. And the things that we're responsible for: clearing title, preparing your deed, closing the loan transaction, dispersing the funds. I'm not going to tell you to go order a termite letter. I'm not going to tell you need a home warranty, for example. That's outside, I'll call it the scope of our representation. And invariably, in most of these situations, we arrive at that point. And I know somebody's probably sitting there thinking, oh, you're just trying to pitch your friends, the realtors. No, I'm not, but I am telling you, don't dismiss the value of a qualified agent. And that leads me to a point I want to make. Don't hire the first agent you see or talk to. Even if you talk to the most qualified person for the job, I think you should always talk to a few agents. Maybe you don't have time to do it in person. Do it via Zoom. Have a phone conversation. Talk to people that you know. Hey, did Tammy do a good job for you? Yes or no? Do a little bit of homework. The difference in agents is hiring a qualified agent. Don't think you'll be disappointed if it costs you a fee if you're well represented. You may not feel that way if you hire someone who quite frankly doesn't do their job up to a professional standard that you should hold them to. So don't make a snap decision as to who you hire. There are hundreds of qualified agents. There's handfuls of unqualified agents, and we work with them all. But I do encourage you to take time. Don't rush into that relationship.
Such a good point, Brad. And one of the things, and I'm not saying that because I'm, a realtor, but even for the type of property you're buying, just to kind of expound upon that, sometimes people feel like, oh, you're only an experienced agent if you've had experience, you've been doing it 25 years. That's not true. There are brand new agents who are students of the industry, who are mentored. They're either on a team or they're mentored by someone who is very skilled. Everything they do and everything they say, they're running past them, but it is specific to the type of property they're helping their client buy. And that's huge. Had a situation recently for a very dear seller who was selling their property. I did not sell them that property. I'd sold them other homes in the past, but this particular one, it was for sale by owner. And the wife of the seller was a real estate agent. And so it was dual agency, which you've talked about before. Now, I truly believe the agent just did not know this is what she should be doing, even though her husband flips homes for a living. She did not know he did not pull permits. She would not have thought to ask that question. But really, as a skilled buyer's agent, if you have someone buying a home that's been renovated, one of the things you should be doing is pulling permits to make sure that that has been done for that property. Well, she sells this client the home. My client now calls me in the future to list the property to sell. We get it under contract. Buyer goes to pull for permits. There are no permits. So now we need to go to the county, which means knocking out walls, doing things that are pretty catastrophic, creating damage, and potentially losing the buyer. So when you are interviewing, it's finding out what it is you want to buy, what is their experience with that product or that type of home, or if it's a 1031 exchange or it's a second home or in that market. I've got agents that are driving 3 hours to sell properties in our market. And actually just recently, an agent was served papers for a lawsuit. And I will say this, their buyer agent is not in this market. They're not even a part of our MLS, but they sold them this home. Now, would they have known the things that the buyer's asserting they should have known, or other people should have told them if they worked and played in this area? I don't know. But knowing your area, that's one of the ways that you can interview the agent, is to see if they're well versed on those sort of things as well. So moving on from that, as you are just kind of observing the real estate industry as a whole, I know that you've talked to some buyers and sellers probably, and because of the media, the big conversation, most people don't know all the rules and the minutia with the DOJ, but they've heard sellers don't have to pay commission anymore. Have you heard this from consumers? What are they saying, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've heard that. Hey, sellers don't have to pay commission anymore, which technically is true. There is no legal obligation for a seller to pay a commission. I don't know if it's as cut and dried as that. All our media is sensationalized, whether it's clickbait or even some respected media outlets. I've personally taken a look at a few articles where the headlines would lead someone to think it is that DOJ, NAR settlement, no longer have to pay commissions. But I think it's much more complex than that. So yes, I do think there is a prevalent thought out there in our community that is the case. And again, I'm not going to take the position that a seller has to pay commission, but I don't think it's quite that cut and dried. Yeah, I guess if you want to go it on your own or really dig in, you necessarily do not have to pay commission. But I do think a seller needs to maybe understand they're going to be asked, and then they have to take that contract and that offer in its totality to go, given the offer I've been presented with, do I want to pay commission? You're right. Legally, you do not have to pay a buyer's agent a commission.
That's a good point. I feel like sellers, that's the first question they ask now is, do I have to pay commission? Because that's all that they've really heard from the headlines. And Brad, you've seen this over the years. You've also yourself bought and sold a lot of real estate. This is my opinion. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but paying commission, people get confused with what it is. For a seller, let me break it down. It's just dollars and cents. Like people are like, will the seller pay for a home warranty? Will the seller pay my closing costs? Will the seller pay my agent commission? Will the seller agree to this, or this? I don't know how much is it going to cost. And if they're willing to lose that money, so to speak, that's what we don't know yet. That's what time will tell. Put it in writing, put it in front of them. So in saying that, sellers are wondering, do I have to pay? Everything is specific to the current market we're in. 2020 through 2023, those were banner real estate years that we have never seen. It was on fire. And I can tell you, in that 3-year period, I did not have a single seller, and this is more than 100 homes that we sold, not a single seller, not one, pay a penny in closing costs, because there was so much demand, there were so many offers. Most of the time they weren't presented, or if someone asked for it, that's fine. They had 12 other offers from 12 other buyers who weren't asking for it, so they just didn't have to. Then interest rates jumped up to 8%, sometimes 9%. And buyers started asking sellers to pay closing costs, not even because they wanted it, but they were trying to do creative financing things like use the money from the seller to buy down the interest rate or make repairs to the house that maybe they would have eaten that cost previously. But the economy shifted, therefore the need and the mindset of the buyer shifted. So I think it's super important for people to realize we don't have a magic crystal ball. Brad does and I don't. I can't tell you that, a seller's ever going to pay commission today or 3 years from now or in 10 years from now. If the industry is always different, everyone wants to say the industry's forever changed. It's all different. It is still a term of negotiation. Brad said that earlier, like anything else. And now it's just more of a focus because we're all going to talk about it together when we're making this offer. The seller's going to think about it at the same time they're thinking about all the other terms and all the other things that you're offering or asking for when you're making your offer. So I think that is the thing for sellers to understand. One thing I will say now, this could change tomorrow. We are what month? October of 2024. You're never supposed to say the date in a video, so it could be evergreen. But for right now, we're going to timestamp this. 100% of my sellers have been asked to pay some portion of commission, if not all of what the buyer agent was wanting to be paid, and they've paid it. 100% of my buyers have asked a seller to pay commission, and they've paid it. Now, will that change in the future? Maybe. The one market I've seen where that's not happening is the luxury market, but I will say this. Maybe the seller didn't pay the buyer agent commission, but then the buyer said, I'm paying my agent commission because I can afford to, but I'm not going to offer you as much on your house as a result. So did the seller make any more money? No, it's kind of a wash in that situation. However, what we observe there and what this tells us is those luxury higher end buyers that have more cash capital, they can afford to do that. So I will say right now in the interim, when a seller says, do I have to pay? First of all, you have to do nothing ever. You don't have to sell your home. Like, you can turn any offer down you want and any term down you want. However, what we know is when everybody started talking about this, it was very interesting. This really kind of broke the news in March of this year. And everyone got really excited and said, sellers aren't going to pay commission. And no one said, wait, but is somebody paying? No one thought immediately, oh, the buyer might have to pay. Now, agents did, and we panicked because we were like, can they afford to do that? We found no, they can't. They were not unprepared for that. And people still need to buy and sell real estate. So what we've seen is buyers having to ask sellers to pay. And then for these offers that these sellers have wanted to take, they've had to decide if they want to pay all or some of that to be able to work with that buyer, because that buyer, the most they can do is what they're offering, and part of that offer is asking you to pay their agent commission. So today, that's how we're seeing it. But like Brad said, it can look very different in the future, and only time will tell what that will ultimately look like.
Yeah, again, everybody wants absolute rules. Everybody wants black letter rules. So I closed my first real estate transaction as a lawyer in November of 2000. Okay, the market in the upstate then to the market in the upstate now is dramatically different. I've been through a couple recessions, a couple slumps, been through the Great Recession. I didn't keep stats on it, but I'm going to tell you most houses we closed during the recession, I'm going to say about every one of those sellers paid some sort of concession. So to say what's the black letter absolute rule, I'm going to tell you the market's going to flesh that out, which is really what the DOJ wants. They want the free market enterprise to flesh out who's willing to pay what? Buyer, seller, combination of the two. They want the free market to decide, again, what are you offering? What are you asking for? And at that sales price, is that something the seller's willing to accept or a buyer is willing to offer? That's really what we're going for.
That's great. And I'm going to let that segue into kind of our next topic. So you've hinted around this, talking about terms and things like that. We've talked a little bit about verbal offers, putting it in writing, and the value of actually putting it in writing as well. But right now, and we're going back to that original statement you made about price fixing and the DOJ, and you're not supposed to be putting that out there. I've heard and seen a couple things, and I'm going to mention them to you and then talk about some strategy and get your opinion on it. So when this first broke free, and this will be in the show notes, by the way, guys. So, and this will come back later. So just try to let your brain focus on this for a second. When an agent thought about showing a home because they knew their buyer had to sign something, when this first broke free, every agent thought one thing: hey, my buyer's not going to be able to pay. I will tell them up front that we'll only look at homes where the seller's paying commission. And sellers are going to pay commission. They just assume that, okay? So that's what buyer agents, and a lot still are telling their buyers. Seller will pay, but if for some crazy reason the seller won't pay, we just won't see that house. Now, before I go further with this, Brad, can you, in layman's terms, define steering?
Steering's where you're basically making sure, if we're talking in this situation, that only certain properties are being viewed by your buyer. And let me go ahead and tell you, that is not acting in your buyer's best interest. You are their agent. That is an agency contract. If you refuse to show half the homes listed in the MLS, you are not being a good agent. You are steering them, taking that person and pushing them away from the home that might be the perfect home for them. That's steering.
So Brad, two arguments I've heard against this, and I'm trying not to steer you into what I want you to say, so let's see if this falls lightly. So one of the arguments I've heard is, well, my buyer doesn't want to see any homes where the seller's not paying commission, so that's why they've told me they do not want me showing them any homes where the seller is not agreeing upfront to pay commission, and not only that, but the amount that I require to be paid. Is it still steering then if the buyer has expressly told that agent that? Now, this is kind of a trick question.
I don't know if that's necessarily the textbook word of steering, but again, I'm going to go back to, how do you know a seller's not going to pay until you present an offer? And by the way, if you've polled the listing agent to find out if they're paying and find out that they're not, guess what? You're doing the exact thing the DOJ was going after. You're essentially admitting that unless there's been 3% tacked on for me, buyer's agent, we don't want to engage in that. Antitrust, steering, unfair trade practices, whatever you want to call it, that's what you're engaging in. Show the house anyway. make the offer, see what happens.
I love that you said see what happens, because I feel like you're better versed in this than anyone, because attorneys are known for negotiating. And I'd love to hear, you just a statement about this. You can elaborate, but I mean, would you say it's true that many times people may have a strong opinion about what they will or won't do, but then when it's in writing and in front of them, have you observed over the years through real estate or anything, do you see that people soften and change and go away from what they said they wouldn't do, or agree to things, that maybe in the beginning weren't things they would consider?
Well, here's something I apply to every negotiation. And for those of you who are going, what's this all negotiation? A big part of my business is commercial transactions, which are all subject to negotiations. I think a commercial transaction, residential transaction, same thing, just on different scales. I say put it in writing, even if the other party said there's no way in a million years we're going to do something. Put it in writing. Let's find out where are the points we can agree on. What are the points we need to work on? Now, am I telling you you're going to win on every time you throw an offer out there? No, you're not. But if it's the right property for you, why wouldn't you give it a shot? And when I hear agents say, I'm not going to show property X, it makes me cringe, because what if it's the right property for that particular client? What if that client says, you know what, I like this property so much?
Okay, so I started to tell this story before I asked what steering was and all these other things. When agents first heard about this, basically the common thought was, okay, your paycheck for working for your client, and by the way, it's illegal for an agent to represent without being paid. So it's not just like, we want to get paid, like it is how people feed their families. But even if we were just like super charitable, you were supposed to be paid for representing. That's what the law says. So that being said, when you heard all of a sudden your commission's no longer going to be listed in the system, and you don't know if the seller is willing to pay you or how you're willing to be paid, not only do you need to have an agreement with your buyer on who's responsible for paying, if in that agreement you guys think the seller should pay, or you're going to ask the seller to pay, whether part of it, all of it, whatever that agreement is, you now need to have something called a compensation agreement signed. And so, and that's not the only way to secure it, but that's where everyone's brain went. And I will tell you, functionally, currently, this is how I see agents engaging. So this is my opinion. You correct me if I'm wrong. And the way this is set up is basically, and I'll role play this, I have a client who wants to see a home. I call you, Brad, and I say, hey, my client wants to see your home at 123 Banana Street. Is your seller paying a commission? And you say, Tammy, yes, he's paying a commission. And then you shouldn't, but this happens all the time right now. You say he's paying a 3% commission. And I did want to say out loud that you said that earlier, that violates the DOJ, because everybody's doing it right now. Not everybody, but most people. So we're gonna do the wrong role play first, and then we'll do the right role play. But you say that to me, and I say, great, Brad, I'm gonna send over a compensation agreement right now. Once you send it back to me with that 3% signed, I'm gonna make the showing appointment. Now, you might say, oh, Tammy, I need to correct this. Now, hopefully you didn't do it wrong the first time, because that would not be good negotiating for your seller. But let's say you say, Tammy, I actually need to correct this. My seller's willing to pay a commission. They have stated it may be up to 3%, but they want to see all offer terms first before they make a decision. And I say, because this has happened to me and to other agents a lot recently, well, Brad, you can let your seller know, I'm not going to show this house if you don't pre-agree to this. Okay, now go ahead.
I think that's just another way, trying to find a way around what the DOJ and all these other folks are trying to eliminate. That's my opinion. I know that's not going to be a popular opinion among your peers. I don't think there's anything inappropriate for saying, will your seller consider paying buyer commission? I don't think there's anything appropriate for you saying, yes, my seller will consider. I think if you go ahead and say, yeah, if you bring me a full price offer, he'll pay 3%. I think now you violate exactly what we're talking about here. I mean, again, I'm going to advise my selling clients, you are not to sign a compensation agreement until you are signing it in connection with a contract that you're willing to accept. That's my opinion. May not be a popular one.
I have a question for you, because when people hear an attorney talk, even though this is very, let's say, just elementary thinking, but when you think of DOJ, you think of legal system, you think of attorneys, we kind of like consumers just kind of group you all together. Okay, you're the law, all right? And so this is my opinion, and if it's way out there, correct it. But I am of the opinion that, I've had sellers tell me flat out, Tammy, I will not pay closing costs for any buyer. And it's silly reasons why. Sometimes it's because they don't want to lose that money. Sometimes it's because their parents didn't give them a handout. They paid their own closing costs on their first home. They're not giving somebody else a handout. There's all different reasons people say that. Now, home sitting on the market. Agent calls me and says, Tammy, listen, I've got a buyer. This home's already, priced a little higher they can afford to spend. They're going to need to come in $5,000 lower. And this buyer has to have closing costs because they don't have this cash. Next question is, will your seller pay? Now, in this situation, I have a seller who said they won't pay. Now, a couple of things I know. One, I've seen sellers do things that they said they wouldn't do. Now, two, I'm never going to tell you what my client will do, good or bad term, okay? Because I don't have the authority to say those things because I'm not the seller. I need to be able to present everything to them as my opinion. But also, what I think about is a seller is going to look at all terms. And if you're asking me whether they're going to take closing cost or not, I've had sellers say never, ever, ever, and then they get an offer and they consider it. So I'm of the opinion, I do not even ask. When I book an appointment and somebody poll me if I'm wrong, turn me in, comment here. There's not a home that I've shown since August 17th, any listing agent who can say, I called them after I made before or after booking an appointment and I asked what the commission was because it wasn't relevant to me. Not because my buyers could all pay my paycheck, it had nothing to do with that. But I thought my negotiation skills matter. There is a way to ask for your commission in the contract. If there weren't, then I would understand the compensation agreement. I also think the contract changed and people got a little confused because it's weirdly written. There's a specific reason our contract's written the way that it is. It has to do with lending laws, but set that aside. But I've seen agents be afraid and not understand how to put their commission into the offer. So they're defaulting to the compensation agreement. But one, my opinion is the compensation agreement helps both agents facilitate violating what the DOJ said to do or not to do. Two, I don't think you should be asking what the commission is because one, the seller may even also change their mind depending upon the terms of your offer. But my opinion is if you're doing a good job for your client, you're a strong negotiator, you just put it in the offer like any other term, or am I thinking wrong about this?
I think you are on the right track. I do think it needs to be in the offer, and I don't think you need to hang your hat on a compensation agreement. I don't think you should be having conversations about what a seller is willing to pay a buyer's agent. I don't think you should be having those conversations. No, I think you're spot on. And I'll say this too, buyer's agents out there. Don't be afraid to ask for the value of your services. That's not to say you're going to get it every time. Don't be intimidated by this change. Don't be afraid. This industry is constantly evolving. I have seen so many changes. I'm part of that generation that had to put 20% down. I mean, there's always changes. CFPB came along, we went through that. We've had lots of changes in my career. There are going to be more. The forms you reference, I'm sure they're going to be fine-tuned. People are going to figure out at your association, hey, we could maybe solve this problem. So, but back to your original question, I think you're addressing it the right way. I think you need to do everything above board. Again, I'm going to say it one more time, be mindful of why the lawsuit occurred to begin with. Be mindful of the court's ruling. The court's ruling was very specific what they thought about this. And sometimes I see, and it's not just your industry, people in society, they try to get cute with it. The DOJ is going to see right through that. The courts, if you find yourself in a lawsuit situation, they're going to see right through that. So don't think by using different verbiage or different methods, you're somehow going to skirt what the intention of this all was.
So, Brad, I want you to, that is great advice. And so since you're giving advice here, I want you to take off your attorney hat, put on your dad hat, because you have 3 beautiful daughters, way outnumbered. And so let's say though, and you're talking to your daughters, they, for whatever reason, strategically don't want to empty out their savings account and or they don't have the cash to pay their agent. Fall in love with the house, and there are actually other ways to get commission paid, but let's say we've exhausted those are all a no and a seller will not pay. What does that mean? Because I really want the house, but I can't pay it. There's none other way to work it in there. Seller absolutely says no.
Well, first of all, I have to say this, ethically by my profession, nothing that I've said on this broadcast is considered to be legal advice. Everybody's situation is different. If you need specific legal advice, come have a consult with me or one of my attorneys.
Yes.
Here's the bottom line, and everybody knows me, knows I'm kind of fiscally conservative. You better know your budget when you start the process. Whether you're paying commission, whether the seller's paying commission, what's your closing cost, what's your purchase price, what's the soft or the hard cost to move, you better know going in. And sometimes part of making these big decisions in life is knowing when you've reached your breaking point. You gotta know it. If you haven't met with a lender and had that person take a hard look at your financial situation, your loan application, your income, your debt ratios, you really should be starting there anyway. So if you're approved for $300,000 and now you've got to pay $5,000 commission on top of that, let's say another 6 or 7 in commission, 300 was your number, and now we're at 315, 320. Guess what? Maybe it's time to go sit on the sidelines and save up. Maybe it's time to take a step down. You can't get it all in one bite. I think that's a big, important thing all home buyers should really think about. And it's really outside the scope of this conversation. But one thing I've consistently seen, and one thing I would tell my daughters, let's know what our budget is. What can we spend before we even go there? And it's much more beyond purchase price. It's all these other things.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just can't get everything we want.
That's Dad Brad advice right there. So you can't have everything you want. That's right. Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to someone recently and they were like, well, we want a Maserati. I'm like, well, is your budget for Maserati or is it for a Corolla? And that's just kind of the end of the story. And like you said, it's other things. You maybe don't need to be looking at homes that need new roofs if you're already at the top of your budget. So good advice there.
Yeah, and remember, you don't have to be in this home forever. It's okay to maybe work your way up to having the dream home in 8 years or 5 years or whatever that case may be. It is the American dream, right? You buy the starter home, you build the equity, you go to the next step in life. That's just the way it works sometimes. I do see sometimes new home buyers stretching to the highest limits of their budget, and it makes me cringe. Sometimes it's okay to just take a little bit less than what we really, really would love to have.
And sometimes you can adjust your home search. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but I have some, I've worked with this awesome couple. It was their first home. Honestly, they had a ton of money in the bank. They had done phenomenal savings in their early 20s. And originally they were looking for, a home that was basically already renovated on acreage. And so we were looking for about 3 months. Everything was like a really good with their budget. And I said, hey, you can totally ignore that I asked you this question. You can hang up on me, but I do want to ask the question. You're kind of describing what sounds like a dream home, what might have been my second or third home. Is it more important right now that you would get into home ownership and start building equity? And for those of you who may not know what equity is, basically when you live in your home, if you buy it for $100,000 and it's going up in value every year, let's say now it's worth $150,000. There are some other costs, but for simplicity purposes, let's say if you bought it for $100,000 and it's worth $150,000, you have $50,000 worth of equity. Again, there's some other fees you pay. It's not quite that simple. But you basically made $50,000 just paying your mortgage every month versus you live in an apartment or you're renting something, you're just paying that money to the landlord, you're not getting any value. So I said to them, is the goal in 3 years that you would have made money while you're just paying your normal living expenses, and then maybe you could take all that money and buy what you really want, but you were making money this whole time? Or would you be happier if at the end of 3 years, if you didn't buy something now, but you continued renting, but then you just bought your first home, then it was exactly what you wanted? This couple said, let me call you back. 30 minutes later, they send me the link for a home. It was the antithesis of what I've been looking for. It was like cookie cutter subdivision, one home on top of another. It was basically a townhome, half the square footage. And they said, we just thought about it. We want to own a home. Like, why are we, in a position now? So we're going to totally shift it. We're not even going to try to get close to what we were looking at before. We're just going to build equity. And then when we have enough money in this home, then we'll go get that other home. And so sometimes it's just repositioning your thought process or waiting. One of the things I want to end on is, well, can you figure out what to do if you can't pay your agent? Maybe it's in your budget. You have all the things saved. You're spending too much on rent. You really need to own, because honestly, it's the same amount of money per month and you might as well make equity. Let's just say that's the case. But then when we sit down with these buyers, it's understanding, okay, that doesn't mean that every seller will give you terms that can work for you. Our job is not only now to find the home, but it's also to find the seller who can accept the terms that you're able to offer. So some of the things you may do: one, wait. Maybe that house doesn't sell. And a seller's mindset is very different after their home has been on the market a period of time. Number two, and there's catch-22s with all these, your lender can actually pay some of your closing costs, which can include your real estate fees. Now, nothing is free. If they are paying, they're going to increase your interest rate, which basically is equivalent of your mortgage payments is going to go up. Now, if you're not already at your max threshold, maybe you're fine with that. Now, financial advisor will tell you do not finance in cost, but if you just know it's good to build equity, that's an option for you as well. You may find that a seller may be able to cover some other costs for you so that it makes sense for you to use your cash for your agent fees. So there are ways to accomplish this. Let's say you buy the home for $300,000 and maybe you're getting a little bit of a discount. It's really worth $305,000, okay? You can increase the purchase price and finance in those real estate commission fees and pay your agent that way. So there are other ways to work it in if a seller won't pay. And that goes to Brad's early point of, so just see the home and make the offer. When the seller says, no, I won't do all of it or some of it, then figure out if there are other creative ways you can work it in. If there's no creative way, that's not the home for you, because not only were you looking for the home, you were looking for the seller who could accept what you could pay, what's in your budget, what makes sense for you. So put it out there. Any other kind of big thoughts you wanted to end with, Brad? Any other parting words?
Yeah, I do want to go back. I don't know if I answered your question earlier about the folks who say, I'm never going to do X. Just remember, people always have an opportunity to change their positions. And that's why, and I've said numerous times, put the offer in writing, send it out there, make somebody respond. So whether I'm the listing agent or I'm the buyer's agent, or I've heard people, well, this guy said he's never doing X. This couple says they're never doing Y. Well, in my career, very few absolutes remain constant, particularly if a property stays on the market a little longer. You know, we've kind of moved into this higher interest rate climate. Things aren't moving quite as fast. I still think we're in a very robust market. I don't mean to tell people to go, wait and good things will happen. You still got to get out there. Another piece of advice, because this is a phenomenon I never really understood and never even considered. And I think now in this new world that we're in, it applies even more. Buyers are becoming more frustrated and simply walking away from the process. And that never really even occurred to me as an option. It might just be me personally. Look, you're gonna have to get out there. You're gonna have to compete. You just heard what Tammy said about building equity and things and renting. I'm a landlord. Hey, I'd love to have people keep paying me rent. But the economics of it is you really should. You're paying principal into something that you hope you get some appreciation. If nothing else, even if prices remain flat, you're building equity that you would have for the next home or to cash out one day, whatever your personal goals are. So buyers out there, don't get frustrated. Well, Brad, you said throw offers out there. Yep, and good things may not happen right away. But don't become frustrated with the process. Continue to do your due diligence. Continue to listen to the people around you that you decide to put on your team, whether it be your agent, your lender, or your closing attorney, and just be patient. And don't become impatient and make bad financial decisions.
Yeah, great advice. For most people, their home is going to be their biggest investment. So, you don't want to shoot from the hip on that. Be patient, wait for it. You only need one home, so take your time with it and go from there. It's good advice. Thank you so much, Brad, for all your time today, your wisdom, your counsel. Brad is located in the upstate of South Carolina, so you can always call his office. If as you find yourself in situations, like he said, you can hire an attorney, ask some questions, always do that. If you have questions about something, read it first. If you don't understand it and you feel like you need to talk to an attorney, you can call his office, hire an attorney there, speak to them. So thanks so much, Brad, and everyone else. We'll connect again soon. Okay, so thanks so much for hanging out with Brad and me today. And here's what I want to be the primary takeaway. Always ask questions. And I want people to understand too, I've mentioned some scenarios, Brad mentioned some scenarios, opinions on the law and what people are doing and practices. And I want to say every agent in our industry, when the news of this broke free, everyone thought, agents are going to be worried how they were going to get paid. No, we knew that there would still be a way to get paid. Our industry has changed many times over in the years, but our concern was immediately for the consumer because people have been buying real estate a particular way for years and years and years. And so to all of a sudden be taking in what the DOJ was saying and knowing that it did not jihad with our state laws, national laws, we were concerned what it would do to the consumer. So a lot of these practices we talked about today are agents in an effort for trying to help their clients accomplish their goal of home ownership and or selling a home with the practices that are familiar, because those we know can work with our existing laws. So everything has been to help the consumer, but right now we're really drilling down on what is the tenet of what the DOJ said. How do we follow the rules but honor the protection of our clients, still position both parties well, but then just as agents talk amongst each other in the industry. You know, one of the things I see a lot in our industry is if you have an agent who's been successful, then a lot of newer agents or agents who have not been in the business as long, they assume that that agent, because they've been successful, are handling and conducting their business under best practices. And that may not be the case. It could be unintentional that they're doing something wrong. It might be that they're learning about how to do it correctly, but others will follow suit. So if you're an agent, of course, I want to encourage you to talk to your broker, talk to the state attorneys, make sure you understand how to implement what we currently understand to be the best practices and laws. But if you're a consumer, just understanding that agents' goals right now are to figure out how do we help you accomplish goals of homeownership and selling the same way that you've always been able to do it. Now, this is a very big twist and turn from the type of videos I typically do, which are just educating you on the suburbs of the Greenville area. So if you are looking to buy or sell in the upstate of South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, or any of the surrounding suburbs, whether it's in 9 days, 9 weeks, or 9 months, or heck, maybe even a year, I would love to connect with you. My team would love to connect with you in one of the ways below. Have a great day, and I will see you again soon.